started.
I'll just throw something up.
Yeah, let Joe get started with his idea about wells, and then we'll go to you, Toby.
Well, just how do you save it? There's only one way, and it's a geographic information system, a GIS, and all my data is in a GIS. It's backed up in other places, but it's, you know, you can put down the location of everything you've done, all of my lines. You can go and click on one, and they'll open it up, and it's all in different software, but it doesn't make any difference. It just allows you to systematically add layers and layers and layers of information, of different kinds of information, and create maps based on using that information in all different ways. So that would be my suggestion. You really want GIS. And there's so many GIS products available for free from the state, because everything the state does is archived in a geographic information system. So, just a thought.
I would say, Jane, you know, that in the big scheme, and I totally agree, that I love the idea of having this bioregion have its own estuary and research site. And I would say that if everyone that had been in the room this morning and is in the room today wrote to our delegation and said we should have a national estuary and research center in Frenchman Bay, that might get traction. And I think Frenchman Bay Partners is the perfect organization to push that, you know, with the different people in the room, the different sort of, you know, representation in the room from different parts of the community.
So certainly, that's come up in the past, and we have, you know, talked to the Wells Estuary and Research Reserve about their process, and of all the reserves in the whole country, Wells is the only one that does not receive state funding. And that's supposed to be part of the formula of becoming one. The state kicks in so much, then the federal government kicks in so much, and then those researchers who come together can also write grants and what have you. But I don't know how it was that, you know, Wells was able to form because a private nonprofit organization said, well, we'll come up with the half that the state would have come up with. And I can't remember the name of their nonprofit, but
It's a local organization, and there are donors to it, and
yeah.
that's where they
And
go.
so it would almost be odd that we could get, you know, the state buy-in up here without the state also looking at Wells and saying, well, it's high time that we kicked into what you're doing. So that's one hurdle, is that trying to get the state involved here when they never committed to the Wells Estuary and Research Reserve. But it doesn't mean that...
Strictly, it doesn't have to be state public money. It can be private money.
Yeah.
And that may be a different approach to it.
Yeah, that we would find the right private source of continued funding. Because I think you can get up to $500,000 a year.
Oh, that's
Well,
entry
no.
level, I think, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, and so then you have to match the $500,000 every year.
I'm not quite sure exactly how that
Yeah,
works.
so it's a challenge, but it would bring the people to this area that could accomplish the current goals, research goals, as well as outreach and education goals that we were talking about.
I thought I saw Toby's hand. Is that?
Yeah.
I just had 2 points. One, I talked to Charlie out in the lobby here about, one of my questions was salinity. You know, temperatures, sea temperature. I know Eddie has dove and didn't mention here in his talk, but he's seen 60 degrees at 60 feet, which is pretty crazy. So temperatures change, but it seems quite confusing because we seem to have a southern species moving north, but also northern species moving south. You know, so I just wonder about the salinity question, and do we understand that? The second thing, I talked to Joe also in the lobby. I run the Osprey for the College of the Atlantic, and you know, I drive all over the bay, and I drive all over our region, anywhere from Great Lost down to Isle of Hope. You know, and that boat could act and is available as a vector for equipment to attach and gather data. If there's a way that we can expand data acquisition, you know, then these are options. And I'm sure there's Diver-Ed, there's many other boats also that could do that. You know, and it wouldn't really cost anything but the equipment to put it on the boat and collect. So I just want to put that out there.
Well, and I was saying to Joe earlier that this Frenchman Bay Partner Initiative and having people, you know, who've gone on the website and signed up and they're partners and were visible and transparent as well. People can see our process, and we have a conservation action plan. that we have adopted, the municipalities have signed on to our process. And so when you write a grant and you cite that this is not just a project that I want to do, but a project that's been agreed upon by a large number of partners around the Bay as a strategy that we want to pursue, I think that gives you a lot of traction in writing grants. And then in my experience, I've had many, many partners in the room write letters of support for grants that I think have really helped move some of the eelgrass work forward. So I think the power is in the numbers and in the commitment to the same conservation targets and the same strategies. So I'm seeing that play out for people, and hopefully as we talk about getting equipment or expanding the kind of baseline monitoring we're doing on the Bay, or information we're collecting, that it'll work in our favor that we ever ventured into this partner operation.
I completely agree with Toby that baseline sort of time series data is critically important to the Bay. I remember as a graduate student diving at a place called Hydrostation S, which has collected a time series of oceanographic data for 40 years. Every week of every year for 40 years, about 25 miles south of Bermuda. And the data is really valuable for resolving some of these issues about what may or may not be going on. We were measuring water temperature when we were doing all our survey work this summer. And we were seeing huge variations. The upper bay is very warm. I was seeing the upper bay at the surface where we were just measuring it when we dump our ROV overboard. Earlier we had done that work on the schooner where we were measuring down at the bottom as well. But the upper bay was 14 degrees warmer than Southwest Harbor, for example. Now that's not a real surprise considering the geomorphology of the upper bay, but it would be nice to have a time series of salinity, temperature, and other features that at one or two locations. The problem is it's hard to fund that because you've got to have somebody going out and doing it or some piece of equipment in the water that just costs money. Jock and then George.
I think the DMR keeps records every time they go sample for the shellfish, paralytic shellfish poisoning and stuff. And the other thing, you can't get there from here, but CERC's got available space for, you want to start something, they might be able to tap into federal dollars. I had a question for Dr. Kelley, and it has to do with the fisheries coming back. I know down Ted and Robin down at Penobscot East are fixated on prey species, restoring alewife runs and other andromynous and cat andromynous fishes so that to draw the cod and other things back in. But I have a feeling that, back when Charlie's original data, 1861, nobody was dragging the bottom back then. There weren't scallop dredges, there weren't shrimp trawls that would go through and stir the bottom. I was wondering if Dr. Kelley, when he does those core samples, can actually tell if there's been any human, if the mud in the top 3 feet is there any way of knowing if an area has been heavily dragged or not?
I never read anything about it, but the fact is there are organisms I don't look at. I'm not a biology person, but there are microscopic organisms, foraminifera, and some diatoms that are really very sensitive to their environment. In salt marshes we work with them because there are 7 of them and they'll zone themselves according to the elevation. Far better than even the plants. And if I can't believe you turned the bottom over and affected it, they wouldn't somehow record that with some other species coming in. So yeah, I think the answer is probably yes, but I've never seen it done.
George.
Well, the point I wanted to make is that your suggestion of long-term monitoring and the suggestion of long-term funding are related to each other. We will not have long-term monitoring until we have a stable source of funding to do it with.
I agree, however, I think that in this day and age, and I think Jordan has done this with Duncan, that we have this capability now of sort of mashing up data and having citizen science participate, where if you at least had a reasonable platform to say that the quality of the data is good, that students, members of the public, and so on, it's not that hard to, if they had a device to measure temperature and then to measure salinity. I mean, I'm sort of jazzed by the fact that people are building plugins to your iPhone. You just plug in and the data goes right into your iPhone and then you can load it up to a website. Now, academic scientists might say, oh, that data is no good because, you know, there's going to be inconsistencies. I'm not sure I buy that. I mean, I think you use the tools you have, and some of that can be done just with citizens. So I agree, George, that a perfect time series is professionally collected, but if you don't have the money, you work around it.
But even the sort of time series you're talking about requires that somebody maintain that website.
Yes, that's a
To be
good point.
hosted somewhere and that somebody monitor the website, because nothing falls apart faster than an unmonitored website.
We're already hosting.
I know about that.
We're already, Frenchman Bay Partners is hosted here, at the BioLab, so there's a little, right? Yeah. No, or is that Seagrasses and Classes?
Both.
They're both hosted here, okay. So, you know, so having a partner organization, for example, we have College of the Atlantic has the Atlas and all that data layers there archived too. So I think to work amongst us with what seem to be the most stable and logical places to have these things. You know, that's again, I think, the power of the partners. And again, there's just information out there that I would like to find, you know, a little funding to be able to spend time with Diver Ed and get some of his stuff into an Excel spreadsheet. And maybe, you know, with some mapped, you know, to go out to where he says he was and get some coordinates and get some maps of Diver Ed's knowledge and maybe some of the kayaking observations that have been made too. I think is something well worth doing as a baseline of what people who kind of know some things, you know, can tell us.
We, a number of years ago, I spent a lot of my life on beaches and in southern Maine mostly, and there were all these anecdotes. You go to innumerable lawsuits and hearings, and someone would remember the beach looked like this, and someone remembered it was bigger, wider, and various things. That it was just these anecdotes, and we couldn't really do much with it. It was always causing problems. And so I don't know, it was a great idea that just, again, the cash register sound went off. Why not get a grant? So what we did is I wrote a sea grant proposal, got funded, where we trained homeowners on the beaches to go out and measure the topography and take photos and make observations on the beaches. And at the same time, to make it scientific, I had a student with current meters and wave measuring devices offshore. So we were really able to understand. We had actually published some good papers on it. It was a 2-year proposal, and we finished, the student graduated, and that was really good. But the volunteers wouldn't stop. They kept it up. And I actually would give them some of these rods we used to survey with, and they wouldn't give them back. And it's okay, I mean, it was the big deal, but they're still doing it. And they actually partnered with the state, who set up a website, and they upload their data every full moon or new moon. They're out there, and they're measuring. There's more and more of them. School groups got involved, scout troops, and they were volunteers, although they were overseen. I mean, I went out with all of them at one point, so there was this oversight and quality control. But for the most part, these were pretty smart people. They were retirees mostly, although you get school groups, but they were all overseen, and the quality was actually pretty good, remarkably good, and it still is.
Any other questions for these two? Yeah?
I was just wondering with, I'm not familiar with the Proctor study or anything like that, but is it just sort of a list of species of what they found, or is there any sort of quantity?
That's one of the
that we
problems is, so if you go into the Proctor, and I will say that Glenn Middlehausen did a huge service in the last decade, and he took Proctor's book, which runs, 300 or 400 pages by dredging site, and he updated the taxonomy to what we think are the current taxonomic names for everything. Proctor gave very limited ability or limited data on quantity, which is a weakness, but we do have the record. And so he'd say rare, present, abundant. But exactly how he defined rare, present, abundant is not all that clear, but it's better than nothing. And, and I'm now looking into the MDI BioLab records, which are in a wood box on old-fashioned 3x5 cards, and I think Jane mentioned it. And to play into the GIS thing, I'd love to take the species on every single card, and the way that it's cataloged is where it was present, how they collected it, and what the date was. And they do say rare, abundant, common, and have layers in Frenchman's Bay to say, okay, this species, layer, it was collected at these 10 sites across the bay over these periods of time. I think, but it's a pretty big undertaking. I think it's a great project for a student, and it'll get done eventually. And it is. It all should go into GIS.
No, yeah. There's I don't know if anyone knows Bob Stenick, but he's
Yep.
a marine biologist an ecologist at the University of Maine's research station. I was just on a thesis committee of one of his students who was looking up and down the coast, doing video transects and counting everything, and I'll have to write her and ask if she's heard of this, this Proctor record.
Yeah, I've talked to Bob over the years because, about this project, and this is one of the, Proctor was, he didn't put out a grid and do a count.
Yeah.
But I'd rather have his data than not know it all.
And it would be great to think that for people 100 years from now, we will have, somehow created, at least here's where we're at in 2013. The work that you and Shannon did, that's forever, So hopefully it gets well archived somewhere, like it gets organized and accessible somehow, somewhere. Yeah.
Rather than just sitting on my desk in my office.
At least you know where it is.
Yeah, and I think the partners, that's a challenge for us as a group to figure out how we're going to facilitate that. And who are the lead partners and how do the other partners support getting some of that work accomplished, setting a time frame for it and just getting it done. So, John?
I just was curious if there's any archaeological data from shell middens that talk about species and are turning up.
In fact, I guess I'm on our thesis committee. A new PhD student is working at the University of Maine. She's in climate change, but she's an archaeologist, and she's working. I remember when we gave her, we had these really fabulously generous graduate student stipends, and she got one. And it's the area she's studying is a midden, and it's I think it's in Sullivan.
No, was that the one over the red paint one in Sereno?
Was it in Sereno? Okay.
They were digging there last summer.
Yeah, that's okay. That's it. The whole point of it is to relate somehow obviously the ecology of the shell midden is highly biased. It's what people could eat, but there's actually a lot more to it, attached organisms, and that she's hoping to try to reconstruct the paleo ecosystem. It's, you reach should exceed your grasp. She's not going to reconstruct it, but she could make some steps. Who knows?
And Jock, I know that historically, and my memory's not very good, but Blaney back at the turn of the 20th century with a paleontologist, a renowned paleontologist who I can't now remember who it was, they were digging in quaternary clays and comparing what they were finding in the clays, like what you find when you do a core, to what they were seeing today. And they did publish that between 1900 and 1910. So there are deposits around. I think a lot of them are subtidal now, so they're not that easy to work on, or you have to go on a very low tide and you might find these clays. And people have looked at them, but I don't know of people recently other than midden stuff.
No do I. That is something. The problem is a core is a tiny snapshot.
Yeah, but the midden, the southern Maine midden stuff, so one of the most remarkable things off the islands is that, when you look at 1,000 years ago or a couple thousand years ago, the second most common fish that was in the middens are billfish, and so and so there's big cod and there's just huge fish, and they're getting these off, dugouts, going through the bay.
Yeah.
And that's, that's just startling. There's also really good tide pool information over the last 100 years. Otter Cliffs, there's about 1920 or so, Johnson and Scutch did a bunch of tide pools. They've been redone a couple times since then in the 50s and 80s, mostly for algae, but really good data now that's almost a 100-year span that's again, abundance, but they actually have pictures, and so you can go back and literally find the same tide pools and look at species distribution. And that seems to have changed quite a bit too.
and then there's the Hans Bohrei data that started here, and then he moved and built his own station on Swans Island, which I don't know what's happened to it.
It's falling apart.
Yeah. And I spoke to his daughter at one point, and then there's a paleontologist, malacologist, ecologist at Penn who's been working on Swans Island for the last 30 years. Peter
Petraeus.
Petraeus, thank you. And there's some good data there. I think, Jane, the other thing that would be an interesting thing to do, and I'm biased completely, is I think this is a great event today, is to put together, and I don't know who would host it, a sort of historical biology, ecology meeting, and it could do from geology through archaeology, because there are people that have worked in this area for many years, and bring Peter Petraeus back. He gave a talk in this auditorium about 5 years ago that I thought was tremendous, talking about changes, shifts in the gastropod fauna in the intertidal. I mean, there's some people that have spent their careers working here that are spread across the United States. Most are in Maine, but not everybody. I think the other thing we're not talking about, and then I'll be quiet, Jane, I promise,
That's okay, that's why you're on the panel.
is if you look at especially the School of Marine Science work that's come out, and the fisheries people have talk about this, is the eastern Maine countercurrent that runs along our coast is doing something, is affecting Frenchman's Bay. And so I was thinking when Ed was talking, that Ed's saying, well, why are we seeing this species suddenly appear, suddenly not appear? Obviously that countercurrent is bringing things from down east to the west, and it's also probably isolating certain things from getting into the bay, like juvenile fish, at some level. But who knows how, that current has got to be dynamic year in, year out. It's going to be different. So some years it might be quite strong and isolate Frenchman Bay, and other years it might sort of peter out and you might get stuff into the bay. And I wonder whether that's why Ed's seeing certain things. And I know there are people out there studying, planktonic larvae in those currents that could tell us a little bit about Frenchman Bay in that sense. I think that's a factor.
I think people think that's why we don't get the red tide coming in from offshore.
Yeah.
I mean, Upper Frenchman Bay never gets a red tide.
I mean, that oceanographic piece has to be sort of mixed in here. No pun intended.
I mean, we certainly had a lot more ice up in Lake Hawk Bay this winter than we had in the last 5 or 6 winters. It'd be interesting. I don't know if anybody ever figured out how that was going to change.
Well, here, that's another citizen science project in my mind, is I'd love to see somebody say, you know what, I'm going to figure out, somebody who lives resident in a bay, take a picture January 1st, January 15th, January 30th for a 5-year period, so there's some idea of, how much ice scour is there in the intertidal year on year. I mean, it should be fairly easy to collect that data if somebody were passionate about figuring it out, and I think that's an effect too, especially in the eelgrass beds. If you get a huge ice year, and then a big wind event that scours the bottom, it's not going to help the eelgrass. I'm not saying that's causative, but ice has got to be a factor. I remember the year Jane had, I went out with Jane doing some eelgrass stuff, and in the upper bay, I remember seeing the stakes that Jane had put in the ground completely deformed and bent over. And I don't think it was a dragger, it was in quite shallow conditions. I suspect that was ice effect. I don't know if George and Jane agree with me.
Oh, no, yeah.
No, that certainly was ice effect, but that's not the only eelgrass in the bed.
Yeah.
And then there's the green, so the green crabs, when we don't have ice, I mean, this is what I hear, I don't know a lot about their local ecology, but, they need a cold winter to die back, so.
This has been a good year to get rid of. Everybody's crossing their fingers.
So that's another thing, people have been reporting that there's been a lot of green crab, they've seen a lot of dead green crabs. I wanted to ask Jim, are the clamors of reporting seeing a lot of dead green crabs in the?
Not dead crab, live crab.
In the winter.
So,
Even in the winter?
no, in the wintertime they don't. There's two thoughts on that. I believe that some of them will bury into the soil and stay there, and I believe you'll find that a lot of them move out into deeper water. And as far as eelgrass goes, I don't believe you'll ever get the eelgrass back until something is done to these green crabs, because they cut the plants off, they chew the plants off. And right at at where the root meets the plant. That much I do know. I've never went out and really looked for it, but I have friends of mine that dig all the time. I dig part-time. We'll say you go out there on certain nights and it moon's out or something, and you look across the flat, it's just shimmering with green crabs. And that's how thick they are. And that green crab forum they had up there to the university, they talked about how many they were getting in the traps in Canada. Now you take a lobster-sized trap and you're getting 200-300 pounds out of a trap. And then you can turn around and go back and fish that same trap the same day. You can haul that trap a couple times a day. There's some thickness to them crabs. And they're proven around here that if you take and protect a plot where baby clams can set in, the clams will set in and grow. But outside of that plot, there's nothing. It's just gone. So anything that's shellfish-wise, clams, mussels, they're doing quite a job on the smaller stuff, and it's not getting a chance to come back.
Do you think you could pay a bounty to people to go out in
There
the moonlight and take those green crabs?
We're Frenchman Bay clam diggers are trying to get a grant to start working on this. Maine
Sea grants.
Sea Grant person, Ian Bryden.
It could be information, yeah.
There's also, I think there's a student at UMaine that's looking at green crabs as a potential for aquaculture food, as like a filler for fish feed.
There is some stuff out there, but who knows where it's gonna go yet. All right, I've heard a lot of things. One thing that they've talked about, and hopefully we'll know sometime before too long, there may be a market for them. And if that is the case, then we can make a little bit of money selling them. That'll help a lot of people get into it.
Do you think, this is maybe far-fetched, but I know my friends that fish, and we used to have a lot of dogfish here at the biolab. And I said, why don't we grind up the dogfish and you guys use them as bait? And the fishermen are saying, no way, they won't go out. Lobsters don't like dogfish as bait because there's urea in the tissues. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I don't know whether the urea amount is even detectable with the lobster, but I wonder if you ground up if you could make an artificial bait out of green crabs for lobsters, and whether lobsters would be
That's
attracted.
been tried,
I've been doing that in Canada.
Oh, they have, okay.
and the results are iffy.
Okay.
But there's the possibilities now, and I don't know them all or anything, but from what I understand, because I'm very interested in trying it, I've sent for my license just in case we can get something going this year. But there is a live crab market in Asia.
Yeah.
Asians eat them. There's a chance, they have some way of being able to vacuum out the meat out of these crabs and make a slurry.
Mhm.
And there's rumors that they're looking to do that. And there's something, and somebody else probably knows more about it than I do, but there's something in the shell that they can take out, I believe it's called chitin, that they can take out of the shell and resell. And if this is the case, there's a good chance that they can do something to create a market, and that's what we're hoping for.
I just, I don't know how far we want this to sort of tangent off, but a big red flag goes off to me when we start talking about market for something like that. You're talking about, when you start a business, usually that means you want to have some sort of a root sustainability. Do you really want green crabs sustainable in your community? I mean, it's an invasive species, so do we want to start an industry around something like this and then actually keep it here, or do we want to eliminate it? A bounty, something like that, makes a lot more sense to me, because if there's one thing we're really good at doing, to put a nickel on something, we can get it out of the environment. We've driven a number of species extinct, so I think we're very capable of getting there if there's a good benefit. But in terms of leading towards an industry that actually sustains and a big red flag goes
I
on.
think the state's already said that they'll support fishery, but not to sustain it, but they will. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, I highly recommend, UNH historian, Jeff Bolster's book, Mortal Sea. He came to Mary last year, and he was on board the schooner with us, and Jeff documents an example of, you know, early examples. He looks at overfishing, starting with the early Europeans coming here before North America was even settled, and they were fishing hard here. But there were habitat restoration projects on Cape Cod in both clams and eelgrass prior to 1900. And people were aware of what was going on, and interesting. But I don't think there were bounties involved in that. But you're absolutely right. We have a history as a Western culture of being good at making things go extinct, and he documents that in his book. We're pretty good at that.
What was that book?
Mortal Sea
Mortal
by
Sea.
Jeff Bolster.
It's in a hardback right now, it's coming out in paperback in a couple months.
Yeah. He also gives a great talk about it too.
Well, we can have continued conversation over lunch. I hope, so being that everyone's wanted to be here, and I don't have worker bees out there, we're gonna all have to work together to get lunch out on the table. But I hope that you will stay just for 45 minutes after lunch.